giving me a little timer, 12%, whatever. Okay, I'm live.
Can start, Rich.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's give everybody a minute or two or three to pile in here, and then we'll kick ourselves off. All right. And greetings from Portland for those who have been following my trek. Not that necessarily that was any fun or interesting, but I actually moved from San Francisco to Portland last June. So I now live in the Pearl District, and anybody nearby, I'd love to meet for coffee when that's safe and happening again. So welcome to Cascadia. All right, let's lean in. I want to use the time appropriately, and people will join as they join. We're going to tell a little story about user stories, but in reality, just giving away the answers before we get there, it's really not about user stories. It's about understanding how to work with our teams and being empathetic and getting good work done instead of sticking to any particular set of tools or requirements or process steps that might not be working very well. So that's the hint as we go ahead. Great. And I'm going to do just 10 seconds of introduction for myself for those who don't know. Here's me, or at least there's my book. So I've been doing software product management, mostly enterprise, since the 80s. So anybody who thinks that product management is a new thing, not so much. These days I mostly coach or mentor product leaders, folks who run product organizations. I design product organizations, and occasionally I step in as a smoke jumper, which means I pick up a VP product or CPO job for a while till they fill it back. Those of you who've been following my blog, it's been up since 2002 because that's when blogs arrived. And I did have the good luck to throw the very first product camp down in Sunnyvale in 2008. So maybe there's some folks who've joined us along the way. By the way, I've pasted into the chat log here the location of the slides. I put them up on as a Google Doc, as a PDF, so if you need them, that's where they are. Okay, so let's dig into some content here. Here it is. As a user, I want to do stuff. And the origin of the story here is I was doing some work with one of many of the development teams I work with over the years, and they gave me two rather bizarre things. The first thing is the team came to me and they insisted that my stories were lightweight. I needed more detail, more context, et cetera, that I was doing sort of sloppy, simple work and throwing it all on them. They were unhappy, which made perfect sense until probably the next day. I think it was probably 2 days later when the same people came back to me and told me that my stories were too prescriptive, right? I was getting in there short, so I was telling them how to do it instead of what to do. And they were really unhappy. Notice somehow both of these things were happening in the same universe. That was me scratching my head. And so the question is, what's going on here, right? What is it that's happening that on sort of alternate days or twice during the week, my team has opposing or contradictory requests for me as their product manager, right? Scratching our heads a little bit. I want to take two side trips before I answer the question that we set up here. And the first one is to remind us of what we know about end users, and we'll apply this to our development teams in a second. But here's something that we should all know, right? Which is that when we ask users what they want, they tell us what they want, but they're often wrong. They don't get the problem statement correct. They've architected solutions that don't work. They aren't thinking about the implications. They're not playing the game 3 steps down. They're going to get themselves in trouble. Often this is in terms of some major customer coming to my company and saying, oh, here's the 47 new features we need to add. And by the way, we also need more ease of use, and the UX is a little too cluttered, right? And those two things can't really coexist, because the more features we put in, usually the harder it is to get the product to work. And then when we unpack those requests or features, we often find that customers didn't understand the system or didn't find the right way to do it, or had again, they were trying to be engineers here, and that's really not why they hired us. Okay, so when we're unpacking these things, when we're applying our good product skills, the first thing to ask is, are we looking at the root cause? Are we looking at the symptom, right? And given that most customer requests aren't very well framed or incorrect, we have to go back to the customers, the users, the buyers, the channel partners, maybe the churned out customers, and figure out what really happened. What was the underlying issue, right? And over and over again, what I've learned the hard way, and maybe you guys are learning it the faster way, is if we just do what our users tell us to do, very rarely does it work out well, right? We as product folks are not in the job of writing down what the customer said verbatim, carrying it to the development team, giving them the post-it note, and then having them do exactly that, because in general, we don't get good results out of that, right? So we need to understand, we need to unpack, right? We need to frame problems, and probably most importantly, we need to share the problem statements and the background and and the context with our teams. And many of you have heard me say this, but it turns out to be demonstrably true that all developers are smarter than all product managers, right? And I'll see if there's anybody on the chat log who can tell me why that is, but the simplest answer is, if we ask them, they will all admit to believing they're smarter than we are, right? And often they're correct, right? Often they're right. So we want to use their brains, not just their fingers. We want to use their ability to unpack problems. So bringing that to our teams is really important, of course, right? And then, getting their creativity, because maybe my solution isn't the best one, right? So that's the one sort of side trip. Robert's saying something about ProductCamp New York. Yes, I was there a long time ago. Good. The other thing I want to do is I want to take just a brief sidestep into Agile basics, right? And notice I didn't say Scrum, I said Agile. And here's a picture of the top of the Agile manifesto. I didn't actually arrive on the Agile scene till probably 05, so I'm maybe a newbie here. But notice that the very, very, very first thing at the very top of the Agile manifesto says, we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Now, it's not that we think processes and tools are bad, but we have to fit those things into our team, into our situation, into the people we have, into the interactions we want to have, and we want to not get dogmatic about it. Somebody asks me what my favorite tool to do something is. I generally want to ask an awful lot of questions before I recommend something. We're going to reapply this to our team in a second. The other thing I put up here on the Agile side is, here's some markers of mine, because I spend a lot of time with many different teams. I look back, I've done engaged with over 150 different clients or software companies since I hung out my shingle in 2001. And there's some patterns here, right? So the patterns I see for good Agile organizations, again, notice I didn't say Scrum, is that we've got whole stable teams. You guys have heard about this endlessly, right? The team works on the same part of the value stream for the long term, for years. We don't borrow, we don't swap, we don't interrupt folks to do that, right? Second marker, right? And the red is really important here. Product managers and their teams, that's developers, that's designers, and anybody else who's along, are going to learn directly from end users. For me, proxies is a 4-letter word, right? I try not to use it. Certainly I don't like to implement it, but if we're just learning from our sales team, our marketing team, the surveys that came in with NPS or whatever, we don't understand what's going on. And I believe if we aren't talking directly to users, real users, every week and bringing our teams along, then we don't know what we're building. All right, let's keep going. Whole teams work on problems as well as solutions. Again, stated as obvious, but when we as product managers just give the answer to our team and tell them to do what they're told, we neither get good results nor happy teams. So on the interesting problems, we bring in the right folks. We get on the whiteboard or the equivalent remotely. We figure out how to solve problems. Okay, keep going. Automated test suite. I'm surprised Automated test suites have been around since certainly the early 90s. I worked on some. This is not a new thing, but companies in the software business that are still doing manual testing, very, very difficult to get quality out the door, to keep on time. Automated testing is worth its weight in gold. So if they don't have it, hard to say they're doing good Agile, right? Objectives or end user behaviors. Stole this from Josh Seiden, of course. We're trying to actually make change in the world, not just check off a box on what we shipped. So we ask questions about whether the things we ship matter, whether users are using them and getting the results that they expected. Okay, a couple more, right? Lots of retrospectives and experiments. That's where we're going to go in a minute. We look at the processes we're running and we decide if we like them and we need to change them. Doesn't matter what the book says. How do our teams adopt and adapt, right? And then the last one, maybe most important, but I put it at the end. We as product folks have to have trust with our development teams. They need to believe that we know what we're doing, that we speak on behalf of customers and bring them in to hear it, that there's good business objectives and goals, on and on and on, right? So again, this has nothing to do with the individual processes you may be following, but I think if you're not doing these things, it's hard to hang the Agile poster on the wall. Okay, let's keep going. So now we're finally going to talk about user stories. Why not? Right. So Ron Jeffries was one of the original folks on the Agile Manifesto. He's written a lot about user stories. Here's his original proposition. You notice there's a handwritten card on the right. And he always wrote about and continues to talk about the 3 C's. There's a card or a Post-it note or a Jira ticket or whatever silly thing you want. Back in the old days, these were physical tokens, right? You could stick them on the board, right? Conversation, because you could never write all the things you needed on a card. That's why we used cards, because they were small. And we want to talk about this with our teams, make sure everybody understands it. And then we want confirmation that everybody got it, right? So on the back of that card, there's probably some acceptance criteria to show that we've actually done the thing we're going to do, right? Notice it's not about form, and the grammar doesn't matter so much. Okay, so I'm going to take a breath here. Mike, anything come up in the Q&A or chat before I dig into the real problem that we framed up?
No, I think we're good to go. Keep going.
Okay, let's keep going then. All right, and I'm just noting Paul Young's good input there, right? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, yet there's billions of dollars being spent on Agile consultants and very dogmatic processes. Yep, okay, so let's come back to our problem. And remember, I have a team that on Tuesdays tells me all of my stories are too short. And on Thursdays, they tell me all of my stories are too long. And in between, I'm not quite sure what's going on. So we did a little bit of retrospective here. Here's what we did. I had my team pull the last 25 or 30 stories. And instead of talking in general, in theory, in universals, what we did was we looked at one of the stories and I asked the team, was this too short or too long? Right? Did you want me to write less on this story because it was too much how and too much detail, or did you want more because I was skimping and it was too short? Right? And what we discovered was it wasn't so easy, right? So here's the questions we asked, right? Which stories are too long? Not are all my stories too long, because of course that can't be true, right? Why are they too long, and what do they have in common? Right? And of course the matching question, which stories are too short? Why are they too short? Do we see a pattern? Right? And what we learned, and what we all learn in these discussions, is there's different kinds of stories, and it turns out that different kinds of stories may need, or different kinds of work, or different kinds of requests, or different kinds of demands may need different ways to describe them. Right? Just because the book says all user stories start with the phrase "as a user," well, I don't care, right? In fact, maybe we don't use that format at all. Maybe there's some pieces of work that we abandon user stories or put them in another system or whatever, right? And as we stacked up these stories, and yes, this was in a physical room back when we had those around a big table, and we had actually printed out all the stories so we could create piles, right? Because that's the easiest way to do segmentation here. And here's what we uncovered. So I'm going to give you, I think I have maybe 6 of these, right? We found that there were different classes of stories, and that I was missing the fact that I was doing sort of the same work on each one. So let's look at the kinds of stories. There were some very UX, UI heavy workflow changes, right? People were having trouble using the interface, and the designer on this team had gone through great trouble with, you know, mock-ups and, you know, all kinds of stuff. And for the UX heavy story, it turned out there was a lot of stuff here, right? There were behavioral goals, there were storyboards, you can read all the things here. And the team was really looking for more detail, because I had just lifted a couple of sentences, and there was all this work right behind it that was going to be essential to implementing this piece of work, right? If we're going to make UX changes, we need to know what it looks like. On the other hand, right, there was a bunch of performance and scalability things where I've got to admit I wasn't the smartest person in the room. In fact, this wasn't the first time for me. I did some work years ago at Wind River Systems in Alameda, California, and they do Linux on a chip and very highly technical operating system level sort of micro OSs. And we had run into a problem where one of the major auto manufacturers was using those chips to run the automatic braking systems on their very expensive automobiles. It was Mercedes, by the way. And it took something like a second and a half for that chip and the OS on the chip to boot up. And it turns out in a second and a half, somebody who owns a Mercedes can start driving down the driveway and get themselves in trouble. So the requirement was to boot the operating system off the chip something like 5 times faster, right? And I wrote the story that said, boot off the chip 5 times faster. And then the team looked at me to say, well, okay, Rich, we want you to write all of the sub-user stories for all the ways we should improve performance booting this off the chip. And we all had a laugh at that, because, of course, there were 3 performance architects in the room, all of whom knew the system better. And I ended up delegating to them the answer of how we're going to make that faster. So when I see things like this performance stuff, what I usually see is, honestly, my team, especially the technical folks, the engineers, they actually know how to do this better than I do. So I might not write this story at all. I might just do the headline that says, boot off the chip 4.5 times faster, and then we're going to break it up among the team for the people who know that part best. Good. Let's keep going. I'll just chug through the rest of these. You'll see the pattern right away. Lightweight bug fixes. You know, we don't need all this mechanism for this. If it's broken, just tell us, you know, how to know it was broken, right? So what they really wanted was the steps to reproduce. And by the way, usually your support team will do this right out. In order to duplicate the case and open the ticket, they'll write out the 5 steps that it's necessary to show that there's a bug, right? We don't need to frame it. We don't need storyboards. You know, somebody digs in and they figure it out and they do the steps, right? Let's keep going. Validation experiments. These are really important, essential. And by the way, your team, if it's anything like any of my teams, loves these. They want to hear about the validation experiments. They want to be part of it. They want to understand how we're going to score it, what we're looking for. They're very scientific in their attitudes, right? And so here, what we did and what we decided to do going forward was a lot more time spent talking through the learning goals. What are we trying to do? And to look for the least possible effort. Maybe there was no code necessary to test and to move forward. So notice again, we're getting more, we're getting less, we're getting less, we're getting more, right? It depends on what we're doing. Last couple, refactoring and tech debt. This is a hard one because usually it comes from the team, not to the team, right? And they didn't need any detail on this. The reason we were working on that tech debt was because the team knew a lot about why it was important. And all they needed from me really was the right permission to go ahead and fix it, right? One-liner. And then one last one that popped up. So when there's artwork or branding that usually comes, for instance, from marketing, maybe we've changed our logo or our background colors, or we've got some other sort of brand-oriented art direction. Well, you know what? My team and I just want somebody to give us the exact pixels because we're going to have no judgment here. We're not allowed to change it. Just give us all the details we need and move on, right? Notice what we're doing here. It looks an awful lot like market segmentation, right? But we're segmenting the market of user stories into where should I spend my effort? And of course, the important thing about this isn't that we did the exercise, it's that going forward, I was able to spend less time on some of the user stories, more time on others of the user stories. And in fact, I was able to delegate whole groups of these to the folks who were smarter than me and better able to get them written, right? And we didn't get stuck on the grammar, and we didn't get stuck on, where it lives, whatever, put it in a place. It's about getting to good answers instead of being hypnotized by some particular process description. All right, let's keep rolling here. Okay, so what do these look like? Because I gave you some examples of those, right? So here's the reproduce the bug, right? Notice it's really simple. Enter an invalid date, leave the account blank, hit update, whatever, 404. That's all my team needs to reproduce the bug and fix it. And it should be pretty obvious what the right behavior would have been. If it isn't, write it on there, right? Similarly, here's the 4x faster boot up answer, right? I delegate this to my performance architect, right? Who's going to write some series of activities or tasks or stories or epics or whatever they are, right? And we're going to keep working on these where we pick something, we prototype it, we see if it has an improvement. If it does, we move it into the production queue. If it doesn't, we throw it away. And we're going to iterate on that until we hit our goal, right? They don't need much more from me. The third one, though, here was a concierge test. And for those who don't know concierge tests, the idea here is we're going to test a new feature, and we're not even really going to implement it. We're going to have a person in the back who's hiding and who's going to implement this particular feature because we don't even yet know exactly how it's supposed to work. Sometimes people label these the Wizard of Oz tests because there's a man behind the curtain you're not supposed to see. And in this case, it was having to do with stock portfolio investments. So a company I worked with where we were doing some of the early robo-advisor work. This would have been, I don't know, maybe 2008. And you want a button there that says rebalance your stock portfolio, but it's a lot of work to implement, and we're not sure whether people are going to want to use this feature or exactly how it's going to work. So what we did was we added the button that said rebalance your stock portfolio, and when you clicked it, what it didn't do was implement a whole stack of software. What it did was it kicked off a message to a person in the back who was going to rebalance that portfolio overnight, right? So we could first learn how to do it. We could see what the response was. We had a threshold of some portion of users who we were really looking to get excited about this. If it was less than that, we were going to throw it away. If it was more than that, we were going to move it forward into implementation, right? Again, cheap, easy, how do we test things, right? Notice that there's not a common grammar here between those three sets of Post-it notes, and I don't care, right? There's no reason to have a grammar check on all the things that go into JIRA just because the book says you have to. Okay, I'm actually blazing through this. We're going to have a lot of time for Q&A. So here's the takeaways, and for anybody who hasn't been in a talk of mine, hint, that's a takeaway container, right? So what do we got? I don't believe there's a universal process for anything, including Agile. User stories are just tools. If you don't want to use them, use something else, right? I don't care. I'm not sure the rest of the world cares. If you and your team have a better way to do something, go do it, regardless of what the book says, right? Try it, experiment, see what happens. Next one down, of course, when we get complaints, and usually they're from customers, but in this case they were from my development team, you got to really open it up and see what's going on. Don't assume that the folks with an issue have correctly understood it or they've given us the correct solution. It's our job to make sure as product folks we understand the problem and we have a good way to fix it, right? So that's why, do what I tell you. I say it wastes half the team's talent, all of their enthusiasm. The surest way to increase staff turnover, staff churn on your development team is to tell them to sit down, shut up, and do exactly what you tell them to do, right? That's not a team I want to work with. I want them pushing back. I want them having hard questions. Makes me embarrassed sometimes. But, how do we harness not just their fingers, but their brains and their hearts? This goes back to all of the missionary versus mercenary. The missionaries do better work. They're happier. They stay with you, and you get better products. Okay. Focus on outcomes and concrete value. I got to tell you, I don't care about velocity. Of course, that's not true. I do care about velocity. But when I'm sitting in my product management chair, I can't change velocity. All I can change is whether my team works on the most important things that have the most impact. So we're trying to get more value out of the velocity the team has, right? What are the outcomes? What are the concrete values? Does anybody care? Many of you have heard me say, the greatest waste in the whole software development universe is when we build and finish a feature on time with really high quality and a beautiful workflow that nobody uses. So waste from the product side is building things that are less important or don't matter. Okay, I think we might have one more here, right? Start and finish what's most important. In my executive level consulting, this probably comes up almost 4 times a week. Executives love to start more projects and initiatives and create more work. And we really know there's good science that tells us that the fewer things we start, the more of them we finish. So don't overload our teams. Remember what's important. Our job is to sequence things to make sure they're prioritized. Okay, and then last, of course, we want the whole team engaged. We want the whole team understanding and participating in experiments, retrospectives. I sit in on my team's retrospectives not because I have an opinion, because my opinion is less important most of the time, but because they may have a bunch of issues that the developers can't resolve themselves, so I walk away with action items, right? How do we help each other? Good. All right, deep breath. Here's how to find me. There we are in Cascadia, and you can see one of my junior office manager there. That's it. I've blazed through this in 27 minutes, so we're going to open this up for questions and comments and anybody who's got something they want to share.
Hey, Rich, are you able to see the Q&A board?
I can see 2 Q&As. Yes, I see
Okay.
Matt.
Yeah.
Matt, how do you?
I'm firefighting another issue right now.
Good.
So
Go. I got it.
Go solo. Thanks, I appreciate it.
No worries. So Matt wants to know, how do you write a user story that a QA person won't be able to test due to it being a system change or some other limitation? I'm not sure I believe that. If you're making a system change, then it's because something's going to happen in the system that's different, or maybe you're making a system change and nothing's going to happen. We probably should have a series of tests to verify what that system's supposed to do. Now, it may not be end user testing. It may be API testing. It may be some automated, storage testing, whatever. But if we're changing a system, I know my really smart engineers can check in a bunch of bugs and break things. So I don't want to ship anything that hasn't been tested. Maybe you and I can go offline on that if that's a deeper question. Okay, Darren, what are some tips for discussing outcomes with teams and things to avoid? Good question. I'm thinking here. I like to focus on relatively measurable improvements. So, for instance, a good example here. We as product folks should always be going back to our support teams and asking them what's broken. But the more specific question is, can our support team force rank the tickets they're getting, either by severity and or by frequency, so I can come back to my team and say, my development team, and say, these are the top 2 bugs we're getting, the top 2 tickets that are coming in. If we can fix these 2 tickets, we will reduce the support load by 25% because that's what we're getting, right? That's a good motivator. Sometimes we're going to be trying to measure upsell, which is hard, but we do it anyway. If we're adding a new feature that's supposed to get folks to buy up from the basic package to the advanced package, reporting back to the team how sales is going really helps. If we ship a new feature that's supposed to close a bunch of major customers in a new market, I want to tell the names of those customers as we close them back to my team. It's motivating, right? Outcomes here are not that I shipped something. An outcome is something a user does or a customer does, somebody outside our company. Okay, let's see. Paul, is boot 4x faster solution? Should be focused on the problem instead. Is there an alternate solution? Good, that's a fair question, Paul. But in this case, I think we were really looking to solve the direct problem, and we didn't want them to abandon our product and go someplace else. So I'll tell you, I think probably the booting up answer was the right one, but been a while. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Emily, any preferred tools for sharing mockups with development teams alongside additional written content? I'm going to plead ignorance on this, which is, I know there's a lot of tools. There's Mural, there's Miro, there's Google Sheets, there's whatever's, Google Slides. I think my answer is, turning it around, if my designers have a favorite tool, then I think I want to use it unless I have another answer. So if my designers tell me that Miro is the best way to do markups and mockups and put text next to it, really their choice. Not my place to tell my designers what tools they're going to use. In the same way that I don't tell my developers what kind of compilers or code management tools or check-ins to do. Out of my hands. If it's not working, if we're seeing that the mockups can't be read or people aren't reviewing them or the designers are having trouble, then we may have to change tools. But from my point of view, I'm indifferent, right? If the team's happy, I'm happy. Good, I'm just coming back to these. Let's see what else we have. Scrolling back up here. Cool wants to know, in a user story, who should we put as the user? Okay, person who's going to be doing the work, person who's going to get the value. When we put a user in, and we often do, I'm thinking about the end person who benefits, right? If this is a workflow change and it's supposed to let the folks who use our decision analysis system run queries better, then the user is the person who uses our decision system to run queries, right? If it's a system administrator who's trying to set up user accounts at the customer site, that's who it is. I really dislike the literal phrase as a user, because it doesn't tell us anything, right? Let's be more specific about who, and maybe it's our channel partners who are having trouble selling because we haven't gotten them a tool. Then let's say, as one of our premier channel partners, here's what I need. Right? The more specific we are, the clearer I think we are on the problem and the solution. So I don't tend to skimp on that. Good. Let's see what else we got. All right. Isaac wants to know, any tips to boost teams' engagement? Really good question. And by the way, anybody else who has an answer to that is welcome to jump in or type it into the chat box or the QA box here. Things I see that get team engagement, I talked some about bringing problems to them. Even more than that, and I'm hoping every one of you is doing calls at least once a week with real customers. I always try to invite one designer and one developer, maybe somebody else if there's somebody interesting on the team, to listen in live to those real customer calls. Now, we have to have some rules of engagement, especially if they haven't done this before. So usually the first time, the rule is I'm the only one who's allowed to speak. And if we're in the same room, they can write Post-it notes for me. If we're in different rooms, we got a chat or a Slack channel open, so we're not confusing anybody. But I see tremendous emotional support, tremendous connection and engagement when my team hears real users talk about what's working and what's not working, right? I really want them to not just hear from me. There was a great example. I did some work for a company down in Los Angeles that does payroll, rather special payroll business, only for the movies and TV studios. And there's some very special payroll issues there. And I got to listen in on a call with a woman who's what they call she's an on-set accountant. Her job is to have an iPad and to be on set and to mark down when the extras arrive and when the extras leave because they're paid by the hour. And this company had an accounting and payroll system that used that as an input. And we got to hear this woman talk about how sometimes the product doesn't work and she's really embarrassed. But when it really does work, it turns out that a lot of the extras, the folks who don't make much money in Hollywood, they come up and they thank her at the end of the week because they got their check for the hours they worked and they were able to put food on the table for their kids. And we got to hear her talk about how important she feels when people thank her for doing her job. And that really motivated the development team because suddenly we weren't just writing SQL statements or putting up, buttons on screens. We could directly channel the people who use the product. I think that's really important. One other thing I like to do for engagement, if you guys have company-wide meetings, like the monthly everybody all hands meeting, find something for each meeting that's some little piece of tech that you can demo. And then the product manager does the 60-second intro about why it's interesting and why it's going to help customers. But then we have the person who built it do the demo, and we call out their name and we thank them for it, right? Because our developers and designers almost never get thanked. The people on the go-to-market side don't know who they are. I'm sure there's lots of other things, but notice I keep leaning toward the emotional side of this. Sometimes we think of our developers and designers as very logical, but they're all emotional people, and we need to get them emotionally engaged. Good. Let's see what else we got in the question stack. Could you please talk a little bit more about prioritization, printing items out and putting them in stacks? Thanks, Jordan. For this, this was really just an exercise in understanding, so it didn't matter so much what we were prioritizing. I've got a bunch of posts, and somebody will remind me later to put them up on a link for everybody. But I have a whole pie chart model I use to prioritize different kinds of things. And the important takeaway, I think, there is it's really hard to prioritize revenue features, which are denominated in dollars, with technical debt, which is denominated in faster acceleration, or measure either of those against customer satisfaction and ticket volume. So I like to do some allocation of budget before we look at those individual tickets. So we know that we're going to spend half our story points or strawberries or engineering weeks, whatever it is, on outward facing features, and we're going to spend probably 30% of our effort on infrastructure, scalability, bugs, test automation, and things that keep us in the software business. So by dividing the different kinds of things into a few buckets or stacks, we can then figure out what the relative effort is. Within those, usually I think it's easier to prioritize because they have the same units. They're measured in the same stuff. Okay, take a breath. Let's see what Brian has to say. Point of view on all engineers being involved in story review versus just team leads. Assuming the former preferred, tips on convincing team their engineers should be involved in the problem solution. I think I'm gonna split this answer here a little bit. So I think bringing all the engineers in on story review on the stories that matter to them is the right answer, because there's a bunch of stories or tickets or whatever we're going to call them that aren't interesting, right? I don't think we need everybody looking at the bug. I don't think we need everybody on the whole team who may not be implementing front-end changes, looking at the workflow changes. But when we've got something interesting and thorny, and there's always a couple in every sprint, I do want to get the whole team together. By the way, that's not just because the engineering lead may have the wrong answer, right? It's also because everybody needs to feel included, and often the best answer comes from the quietest person on your team. So as we're doing these, part of your job, I think, certainly part of my job, is to look around the room and pay attention and see who's not talking and ask them for their opinions up front and hold back some of the folks who are always leaping to conclusions. You get real team coherence, you get better understanding of this. If somebody's out sick for a couple of days, then somebody else understands what's going on, right? So I guess I'd give the same answer I gave before about longer or shorter stories. Kind of depends. And worth asking your team what's working. Do the retrospective on this, right? I expect most of them want to look at most of the interesting stories, and none of them want to look at the trivial ones. Okay, we got time for one or two more here. Let me see where we are. Okay. Prakar wants to know, how do PMs understand and negotiate the effort estimate for a story? I don't think we do. So if I'm not coding and I'm not designing and I'm not doing test automation and I'm not writing the docs, I think my opinion about how hard this is much less useful than the people who are going to do the work, right? If we go back to, and I'm just going to flip back to it, the very last thing on my Agile checklist that was the key word here as I'm going back is, come on, there we go. The last word here is trust. So if you don't trust your team to give you good estimates, you have an issue. But I think unless you're going to do the work, I'm not excited about you overriding their estimates, right? They have to do the best they can. You can go back at the end of a sprint and see which things went long and went short. Maybe as a group you can figure out how to estimate better. I think our job as product folks is to help our teams estimate better, not to critique their estimates. Okay, Alana, top advice for newly formed teams, how to get on the same page. This is hard. I'm not sure I have any magic here. In pre-COVID or maybe post-COVID days, I'd say the most important thing is to take your newly formed team out for a meal together. Because if we're all talking and sharing food and a drink, it turns out we build trust and we build empathy. And then, in the first sprint or two, I would frame everything as experimental. Let's try this technique, and at the end of the week, if we don't like it, we're going to throw it away. Let's try this other approach. You want to use that tool? That's okay. Let's give it a run. I think the more you can bring people into the process, the more likely you are to frame something up, right? So retro is really important. Trust is really important. Your sharing of lots of context. Make sure your team understands who uses your product, why they use it, how it adds value, how much money it makes for the company, who sells it. I try to walk them through the whole product cycle, including the outside stuff, because they're really hungry to know. Good. Okay, I think we got time for one or two more here. Matt, what do you do when engineering manager dictates the how and wants it in your user story? The engineer won't go down the wrong path, quoting them in the user story. I think that's a sidebar. I think if I, as a product manager, and somebody else as an engineering manager aren't in agreement, we close the door, we have a discussion, we try to figure it out. I would probably take the position that says we don't need the how in there, but the engineering manager is welcome to look over the shoulder of the junior engineer who might need help. But a lot of ways to solve that. Again, I don't want to be dogmatic about what's in or out. I don't care. I do want to be dogmatic about empowering the folks on the team to do their best work. So if engineering managers writing all the hows into the story makes your engineers feel put upon and unloved, then we need to take it out. Okay. Is there anything else in here? Herman, how do you convince the team to write user stories when they don't think it's, when they don't think it's their responsibility? Well, a lot of ways to do this. The one I did most recently was I offered to write all the user stories, and then I told them that some of those user stories were going to be worthless and terrible and not be very helpful, but that it was my job to do it, and I was going to do it as best I can, but that if anybody on the team wanted to help me, we would get more work done faster and be happier and know what our stories were about. And you'd be surprised how many folks want to help if we frame it as a collective win instead of responsibilities. I've never found a job description that really did a good job of telling me who does what. Your team is going to have a different division of labor than every other team, and that's good and that's fine. And there's no particular reason why I have to write any of these things, right? If the team and I decide we're going to do it a different way, and the work gets done and we ship good stuff and we get to our outcomes, I don't think it makes any difference, right? And maybe, honestly, maybe there's somebody on your development team who thinks he or she wants to be a product manager someday and wants to volunteer to do this stuff, and that's great. Quick way for them to realize they'd rather be engineers. But you know, I think when we're talking about responsibility, we're in the sort of HR realm of it's your job and I'm not helping, right? Screw you. That's not so helpful, right? How do we get everybody working together so we're each doing our jobs, but we help each other? Good. All right, I think that's all we've got here, unless somebody has a new one. All right. Last thing here, anybody who hasn't been to my blog, I'll give you here's the address, no surprise. I bought that domain in 1994, I think, before the Russian Federation was on the net. And anybody who doesn't have a copy of my book, drop me an email and I'll be happy to send you the bits. Okay, thanks for everybody. Thanks for coming to Product Camp, and I'll be listening in a lot of the sessions with you as well. And I'm really can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to next year when we get to do this in person. Great, thanks.